January 1944. Berlin shivers under a pale winter sun. Smoke drifts from shattered factories at the city's edge, mingling with the distant echo of air raid sirens. Soldiers trudge through snow-caked streets, their breath clouding in the icy air. Across Europe, the Axis war machine, once unstoppable, shows the first cracks in the Pacific. Dawn breaks over a coral atoll. Japanese soldiers cling to bunkers, the surf lapping at the shore, while reconnaissance planes hum overhead, unseen but unrelenting. The promise of conquest fades with every intercepted message, every lost supply convoy. Rome is quiet now, the streets haunted by whispers of defeat. Mussolini's speeches no longer stir the crowds. Once, bold generals stare at maps littered with red lines that shrink with every Allied advance. The Axis powers, long feared and admired for their precision and brutality, are faltering. Their victories, carved in blood and steel, have begun to crumble under the relentless pressure of global opposition. And yet, the full story of why they failed, the untold combination of decisions, miscalculations, and human frailty, is only now coming into focus. By 1941, the Axis powers stood at the height of their dominance. Germany had swept across Western Europe with astonishing speed, conquering France, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia. Italy controlled large swaths of North Africa, while Japan had carved an empire across East Asia and the Pacific, seizing Hong Kong, Malaya, and the Philippines. On paper, the Axis appeared invincible. The German war machine, fueled by a robust industrial base and innovative tactics, relied on blitzkrieg, lightning warfare, designed to overwhelm enemies before they could react. Tanks tore through the Ardennes, paratroopers landed behind enemy lines, and Luftwaffe bombers reduced cities to rubble. Hitler's generals meticulously planned operations, yet tension simmered beneath the surface. Rivalries, personal ambition, and ideological rigidity shaped every decision. Japan, in contrast, had achieved rapid victories across vast oceanic distances. Carrier task forces, meticulously trained and coordinated, struck with deadly efficiency. Yet even here, cracks were forming. Overextended supply lines and the sheer scale of territory under Japanese control created logistical nightmares that the Allies would exploit in the coming year. Despite the appearance of strength, the Axis coalition was fragile, held together by ideology more than logistics, ambition more than adaptability. Their initial triumphs had been blinding, but beneath the surface, structural vulnerabilities, overextension, and inflexible command hierarchies were quietly sowing the seeds of eventual collapse. The stage was set. The Axis powers had conquered much, yet the pressure of multiple fronts and a determined opposition was beginning to close in. By late 1942, the tide of war began to shift. The Allies, once on the defensive, started coordinating a global strategy to contain and reverse Axis advances. In the East, the Soviet Union, having absorbed staggering losses, began to push back against the Wehrmacht. The Battle of Stalingrad, beginning in August 1942, would soon mark the first major turning point, exposing critical weaknesses in German planning, logistics, and underestimation of Soviet resilience. Across the Mediterranean, the Allies launched Operation Torch in November 1942, landing forces in Morocco and Algeria. Italian and German troops were forced into a defensive posture, and the North African campaign became a grueling war of attrition. The desert, once a theater of Italian ambition, revealed how stretched Axis supply lines had become. Fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements struggled to reach the front lines, slowing advances and amplifying losses. In the Pacific, the United States, fully mobilized after Pearl Harbor, began to leverage its industrial capacity. Aircraft carriers, submarines, and naval aviation began to reclaim territory. Key battles such as Midway in June 1942 shifted strategic initiative to the Allies, halting Japanese expansion and marking the start of a slow but steady push across the Pacific Islands. Japanese forces, overextended and reliant on fragile supply chains, could not replace losses fast enough. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence operations, code-breaking, and logistical coordination increasingly undermined Axis strategies. The breaking of the Enigma code allowed the Allies to anticipate German movements in the Atlantic and Europe, while the Allies' ability to produce vast quantities of tanks, aircraft, and ships outpaced the Axis capacity to respond. These advantages compounded the strain on Axis forces, forcing hurried, often flawed decisions. The Axis powers, though initially dominant, were now confronting the reality of a global opposition capable of exploiting their weaknesses. Multi-front warfare, overstretched resources, and relentless Allied adaptation began to expose structural flaws that would eventually unravel the Axis coalition. The stage was shifting. The Axis' early triumphs had created the illusion of invincibility, but beneath the veneer of power, cracks were widening. Their human, technological, and strategic limits were about to collide with the full force of the Allied response, setting the stage for a series of decisions, battles, and miscalculations that would ultimately determine the fate of the war. By 1943, the human cost of war was beginning to weigh heavily on the Axis forces. German soldiers on the Eastern Front endured brutal winters, shortages of food, and relentless Soviet offensives. Morale, once bolstered by early victories, faltered as death and exhaustion became constant companions. In Italy and North Africa, soldiers faced not only Allied attacks but also a creeping awareness that their efforts were stretched across untenable fronts. Japanese troops, isolated on Pacific islands, struggled against starvation, disease, and relentless air and naval bombardments. Civilians, too, suffered. Cities in Germany, Japan, and Italy were increasingly targets of Allied bombing campaigns, eroding the home front's support and creating fear, fatigue, and despair. Human endurance, no matter how disciplined or ideologically driven, was being tested to its limits. Decisions at the top revealed fractures in Axis cohesion. Hitler's obsession with total control increasingly interfered with strategic flexibility. Commands were often delayed, contradictory, or driven by ideology rather than military logic. Mussolini's faltering leadership and lack of operational competence undermined Italian forces, leaving German allies to compensate for repeated failures. In Japan, Tojo and his military council struggled to prioritize between defensive strategy and ambitious expansion, creating confusion and overextension. Leadership errors, compounded by mistrust and rigid hierarchies, translated directly into battlefield setbacks. Early technological advantages gave the Axis powers a sense of superiority. German tanks, advanced aircraft, and precision artillery initially dominated the battlefield, while Japanese naval aviation struck fear across the Pacific. Yet over time, innovation lagged. Allied industrial capacity began to surpass Axis production, introducing superior tanks, long-range aircraft, radar, and code-breaking technologies. German jet aircraft and advanced submarines arrived too late to alter strategic outcomes, while Japanese aircraft became increasingly outclassed by newer Allied designs. Technology, once an advantage, could no longer compensate for stretched resources, manpower shortages, or flawed strategy. The human strain, leadership rigidity, and technological limitations were converging. Soldiers and civilians alike faced the crushing weight of an overextended war machine. Commanders wrestled with impossible decisions, and machines that once symbolized Axis dominance now struggled to keep pace with Allied innovation. Axis armies, once celebrated for rapid, decisive maneuvers, began to falter under the weight of multi-front warfare. German blitzkrieg, so effective in Poland and France, struggled against the vastness of the Soviet Union. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles across destroyed infrastructure, leaving tanks and infantry vulnerable. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps faced relentless Allied logistics and reinforcements, forcing defensive retreats. In the Pacific, Japanese defensive strategies relied on fortified islands and attrition, but Allied amphibious assaults and naval superiority undermined even the most carefully constructed positions. Tactical brilliance could no longer overcome the sheer pressure of attrition and coordination from global opponents. Allied adaptation became a decisive factor. The Soviet Union's capacity to absorb losses and reorganize armies shocked the Wehrmacht. American industrial might enabled mass production of tanks, aircraft, and ships, sustaining a war effort across multiple continents. British intelligence, code-breaking, and skilled logistics allowed the Allies to anticipate Axis moves and exploit weaknesses. Combined, these efforts meant the Axis faced opponents capable of countering technological advantages, reinforcing fronts, and coordinating large-scale offensives, neutralizing what had once been decisive superiority. The Axis ideology, initially a source of cohesion, gradually became a liability. Nazi propaganda, intended to sustain German morale, faltered as citizens faced mounting bombings, shortages, and military defeats. In occupied territories, local resistance movements grew, sabotaging supply lines and gathering intelligence for the Allies. In Japan, the glorification of sacrifice collided with logistical reality, leaving soldiers stranded on islands with insufficient support. Italian society, disillusioned by Mussolini's failures, increasingly questioned the purpose of the war. Morale, both civilian and military, eroded steadily, compounding material and strategic deficiencies. These angles, tactical, enemy and moral, intertwined with the human leadership and technological pressures already in play. The Axis powers were not collapsing from a single flaw. Rather, a cascade of vulnerabilities across multiple dimensions was converging. Soldiers exhausted, leaders indecisive, technology lagging, and morale crumbling. Together, these forces were steering the Axis toward an inevitable turning point. The stage was set. What had once seemed unstoppable was now fraying at the edges, preparing for decisive battles that would seal the Axis' fate. The turning of the tide came not with a single strike, but through a series of relentless blows that exposed the Axis vulnerabilities. On the Eastern Front, Stalingrad became a symbol of German overreach. In August 1942, Hitler's Sixth Army advanced into the city, confident that the blitz of artillery and armor would secure victory. The Soviets, however, had fortified every street, factory, and building, turning the urban landscape into a deadly trap. German soldiers, cut off from supplies and encircled by the Red Army in November, faced freezing temperatures, starvation, and constant assaults. By February 1943, the Sixth Army surrendered in one of history's most devastating defeats, marking the first major strategic reversal for the Axis in Europe. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the Battle of El Alamein in late 1942 revealed the limits of German-Italian coordination. Field Marshal Rommel's experienced Afrika Korps, despite initial successes, could not overcome the steady influx of British reinforcements and superior logistics. The Allies' well-prepared defenses, coordinated air support, and relentless artillery barrages turned the desert into a killing ground. Rommel's retreat across the sands signaled the collapse of Axis hopes in Africa and opened the Mediterranean to Allied control. Across the Pacific, the Battle of Midway in June 1942 shattered Japanese naval supremacy. American codebreakers had anticipated the Japanese plan, allowing a smaller U.S. force to ambush 4 aircraft carriers, sinking them in hours. Japan's loss of experienced pilots and carriers halted their expansion and shifted the strategic initiative to the Allies. Subsequent island-hopping campaigns, like Guadalcanal, exposed Japanese vulnerabilities in logistics and reinforcements, showing that territory could no longer guarantee security. These battles, disparate in location but united in consequence, revealed a pattern. The Axis powers, despite tactical skill and initial brilliance, were being systematically outmaneuvered by opponents who leveraged intelligence, logistics, and adaptability. Every miscalculation, overextension, and delayed decision compounded losses. Soldiers, once confident, now faced exhaustion and despair. Commanders struggled to respond to crises with diminishing resources, while technology and strategy that had once secured victories could no longer compensate for fundamental weaknesses. The Axis, once dominant across Europe, Africa, and the Pacific, was beginning to crumble under the weight of relentless pressure. Yet even as fronts collapsed and armies were encircled, the full extent of the unraveling had yet to be realized. The stage was set for the final series of defeats that would irreversibly seal the Axis' fate, leading directly into the decisive moments of 1944 and 1945. By mid-1944, the Axis powers were in retreat on nearly every front. In Western Europe, the Allied invasion of Normandy on the 6th of June, 1944, day marked the beginning of Germany's final strategic unraveling in the West. Over 150,000 troops landed on the beaches under constant fire, supported by thousands of ships, tanks, and aircraft. German defenses, stretched thin and constrained by Hitler's rigid command, could not repel the invasion. Cities were lost, armies encircled, and morale among troops plummeted. The Allies advanced through France with unprecedented speed, liberating Paris by August and forcing German forces into desperate defensive positions. In Italy, the fall of Rome in June 1944 further signaled Axis decline. Mussolini's regime, already weakened, collapsed entirely, leaving German forces to conduct fighting retreats through the peninsula against Allied offensives. The Italian campaign drained resources and diverted German attention from other critical fronts. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army's Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944 annihilated the German Army Group Center, recapturing Belarus and pushing into Poland. The scale of destruction was staggering. Entire divisions destroyed, equipment lost, and commanders overruled or executed for perceived failures. German forces could no longer mount effective counterattacks, and Hitler's insistence on holding territory at all costs only accelerated collapse. In the Pacific, 1944 and 1945 saw Japan increasingly confined to shrinking island strongholds. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 destroyed much of the Japanese Navy, severing supply lines and isolating garrisons. Kamikaze attacks, a sign of desperation, reflected both Japan's tactical innovation and its grim reality. Trained pilots and ships were irreplaceable, yet the industrial and logistical capacity to support them had collapsed. Leadership crises compounded these military disasters. Hitler increasingly isolated himself in the FA bunker, issuing unrealistic orders. Mussolini had already been deposed, and Japan's military leadership faced internal disagreements and a government increasingly incapable of coordinating strategy. Across the Axis, commanders confronted a simple truth. Even the most disciplined troops and advanced weapons could not overcome exhaustion, overstretched fronts, and an adversary now united, coordinated, and industrially superior. By late 1944, the collapse was no longer imminent, it was inevitable. The Axis powers had been steadily dismantled by battles, attrition, leadership failures, and strategic miscalculations. The world was about to witness the final chapters of a war that had once seemed destined to favor the Axis, and the consequences would reshape nations, societies, and the global order forever. The surrender of the Axis powers unfolded as a sequence of monumental, often chaotic events, leaving a trail of destruction, death, and political upheaval. Germany's defeat, officially formalized on May 8, 1945, came after nearly 6 years of war that had claimed the lives of an estimated 5.5 million German soldiers and over 2 million civilians. Entire cities, Berlin, Dresden, Hamburg, lay in ruins, decimated by relentless Allied bombing campaigns. Factories that had once produced tanks, aircraft, and ammunition were reduced to rubble, while railways, bridges, and ports were systematically destroyed, severing supply lines and isolating surviving military units. The human toll extended far beyond the battlefield. Millions of displaced persons roamed the shattered landscapes of Europe. Families torn apart by forced evacuations, concentration camps, and the relentless sweep of armies. PO camps overflowed. Starvation and disease claimed thousands even after hostilities ceased. Amidst the wreckage, the German people confronted not only the physical devastation of their cities, but the psychological weight of ideological collapse. The propaganda that had once glorified conquest now rang hollow, leaving citizens to face the enormity of the war's cost and the horrors committed in its name. Italy's defeat, formally marked in 1945 but effectively unfolding earlier, left the nation politically fractured. Mussolini's execution in April 1945 symbolized the end of fascist rule, while German forces occupying the north continued to resist until the final weeks of the war. The Italian army, inadequately equipped and demoralized, had suffered heavy losses in campaigns across North Africa, the Balkans, and its own homeland. Cities such as Naples, Milan, and Bologna bore the scars of both Allied and Axis operations, and civilians endured widespread shortages of food, medicine, and shelter. Italy's post-war reconstruction would require years of international aid and domestic reform. In the Pacific, Japan's surrender on the 15th of August 1945 followed the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with the relentless advance of Allied forces across the Pacific Islands. Japanese forces, once masters of naval and air power, had been systematically destroyed through island-hopping campaigns, submarine blockades, and air raids that decimated urban centers. The Imperial Army and Navy, overstretched and outmatched, could not prevent the collapse. An estimated 2 million Japanese military personnel and hundreds of thousands of civilians perished in battles, bombings, and starvation, leaving the nation in economic ruin and moral disillusionment. The Axis collapse was not merely military, it was structural. Supply chains, industrial capacity, and logistical networks that had fueled early victories were obliterated. Leadership hierarchies were discredited, leaving power vacuums and fractured governments. Across Germany, Italy, and Japan, political systems faced complete reconstruction, while former territories struggled with occupation, repatriation, and rebuilding society from near total devastation. The long-term consequences of the Axis collapse reshaped the global order. In Europe, Germany was divided into occupation zones, controlled by the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and later France. The devastation of infrastructure and industry necessitated the Marshall Plan, through which billions of dollars in aid would help rebuild Western Europe and prevent economic collapse from reigniting political extremism. Germany's division into East and West laid the groundwork for the Cold War, a geopolitical tension that would dominate the latter half of the 20th century. Italy emerged from fascism politically fractured. The monarchy was abolished and a republic established in 1946, but the scars of war, occupation, and internal divisions persisted. Economic recovery was slow, and Italian society had to contend with the legacy of fascist ideology, collaboration, and resistance. In the post-war years, Italy relied heavily on Allied support and a reinvigoration of democratic institutions to rebuild civic trust and stabilize governance. Japan faced a profound transformation. The emperor, once considered divine, was constrained under the new constitution imposed by Allied occupiers. Cities lay in ruins, industries had been destroyed, and the population faced widespread hunger and dislocation. Yet, under Allied guidance, Japan embarked on unprecedented reconstruction, eventually developing a pacifist constitution, democratic institutions, and economic systems that would fuel its post-war miracle. The psychological impact of the atomic bombings and total defeat left an enduring impression on Japanese society, shaping attitudes toward militarism and foreign policy for generations. The Axis collapse also left an indelible mark on the global military and technological landscape. The war had accelerated advances in aircraft, tanks, naval vessels, and code-breaking technology, creating a blueprint for post-war military doctrine. Nuclear weapons, jet propulsion, and radar technology, all refined or accelerated during the conflict, would become central to global power dynamics. Countries that had invested in education, industrial capacity, and technological innovation emerged stronger, while those that had overextended themselves without sustainable infrastructure suffered prolonged setbacks. Culturally and morally, the Axis defeat prompted reflection on human cost, responsibility, and justice. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted leaders for war crimes, setting precedents in international law. Occupied nations sought restitution, remembrance, and reconciliation. Across the globe, the collapse of ideologies that had justified conquest and oppression revealed the limits of propaganda, totalitarian control, and militaristic hubris. Ultimately, the Axis collapse demonstrated that military victories alone cannot sustain a coalition built on overambition and ideological rigidity. Strategy, logistics, leadership, human resilience, and adaptability proved decisive. The consequences of defeat reverberated across generations, influencing international relations, political boundaries, economic development, and collective memory. The collapse of the Axis powers was more than a military defeat. It was a convergence of human, strategic, and moral limitations. From the icy streets of Stalingrad to the sun-scorched islands of the Pacific, the Axis learned the hard truth. Even immense ambition and early victories cannot withstand the combined forces of resilience, adaptation, and global coordination. Soldiers, civilians, and leaders alike were swept along by decisions that, in hindsight, revealed both brilliance and fatal flaws. History remembers the Axis not only for the destruction they wrought, but for the lessons their failure offers. Overreach, inflexibility, and the underestimation of an opponent proved fatal. Technology, while essential, could not compensate for stretched supply lines, exhausted troops, or fractured leadership. Morale, ideological fervor, and propaganda could not sustain societies under relentless pressure from well-coordinated adversaries. Yet amidst the devastation, the human capacity for recovery and learning became evident. Europe rebuilt, Japan redefined itself, and the world created institutions intended to prevent such widespread conflict from recurring. The Axis collapse also reshaped warfare itself, emphasizing the importance of intelligence, logistics, innovation, and the moral dimension of leadership. Victory and defeat were not determined solely by weapons or territory, but by the interplay of strategy, human endurance, and adaptability. The story of the Axis collapse is at its core a cautionary tale. It demonstrates the limits of ambition, unchecked by pragmatism, the dangers of rigid ideology in the face of complex realities, and the enduring power of coordinated effort against seemingly insurmountable odds. The ruins of cities, the silence of battlefields, and the testimonies of survivors remind us of both the cost of hubris and the resilience of humanity. In reflecting on these events, we are reminded that history is not merely a chronicle of victories and defeats. It is a study of choices, consequences, and the human spirit. The Axis collapse reshaped the 20th century, leaving a legacy of caution, reflection, and hope. That even in the darkest chapters of war, lessons endure, guiding future generations toward a more deliberate and humane path. And so, the untold story of the Axis collapse stands as both a record of failure and a testament to the enduring principles that determine the course of history.